For centuries, developing countries around the world have been shaped by the presence of the Catholic Church and Christian missionaries. They've been replaced by well-funded organizations that are doing them no good. Please join me. We're going to talk about that. Jim Kelly is a religious liberty attorney and the executive director of the Solidarity Center for Law and Justice in Atlanta, Georgia. He's joining me today to discuss something that not many people know very much about and you need to know about, and it's the impact of civil society organizations, used to be referred to as NGOs or non-governmental organizations, on the character of nations developing around the world. Jim Kelly, welcome.
Thank you, Dale.
Now, you've been working really very hard for a number of years. You have kind of cutting-edge viewpoint and understanding of what's going on, and it's the kind of thing that can seem very abstract when you've never heard about it because it involves the United Nations, the World Bank, the European Union, Amnesty International, all kinds of things. We want to try to put the pieces of this puzzle together for our viewers so they understand why a lot of harm is being done by the combination of the United Nations, some of its agencies, including the World Bank, the civil society organizations, and big funders like George Soros who are coming along and dumping money into their programs.
Well, you're right on target. It is cutting edge. And like the phenomenon of globalization itself, it's moving at a very rapid pace. Fortunately, one of the marks of globalization is the internet, and that's what's enabling people like me to keep up on this phenomenon. And
globalization just means the interconnection of nations, the interconnection of peoples?
The growing interconnection. Certain recent developments in the area of communications. Global media now is reaching people all over the globe. You have the satellite transmissions, you have the internet, capitalism. More multinational corporations are able to do business abroad. They're able to staff their positions abroad. They'll be able to buy raw materials, produce their goods abroad. You'll get more development in terms of multinational corporations coming in with other agencies and improving the lives of the people who are now working for multinational corporations in countries that had never experienced such economic development.
But as they come in more contact with the West and the money and the power and the institutions of the West, that can be a double-edged sword.
It can be, primarily because of two things that go along with globalization. One, you would think in theory is a good thing, and that's democratization, the rule of law, transparency and accountability in institutions. The second thing is the increasing secularization that comes along with globalization. Secularization being the removal of any religious discussion or formation from the public square. A lot of third world and developing democracies, religion has played a valuable part for centuries, and now they're finding that under Western ideas of what democracy should be, they really don't have the same place at the table that they used to.
The same problem we're having with keeping democracy in the public square in the United States, that's being exported. And it's being exported by what you call civil society organizations, such as?
Civil society organizations. The Catholic Church was the first and is still a leading civil society organization. Now you have other groups such as Amnesty International, which is a human rights organization, the World Council of Churches, which is a more ecumenical group of churches, the World Wildlife Fund. You have George Soros, who you mentioned earlier, is one of the largest financiers of democratization and secularization around the globe.
Through some of these organizations.
That's correct.
Right.
And civil society is really those voluntary associations that citizen groups and advocates form to minimize some of the negative effects of globalization.
But if the Catholic Church is being pushed out, who's taking the place?
Well, the United Nations, for one, is taking the place of the Catholic Church. And the United Nations has, as one of its special agencies, an organization called the World Bank. and the World Bank is the chief development arm of the United Nations.
Is that kind of the USAID of the United Nations?
Yes, it is. The USAID being the United States Agency for International Development.
In the State Department.
That's correct. USAID is a global civil society organization in that it partners with grassroots social movements and other groups to affect change and affect positive development in other countries.
How much money does the World Bank give away?
The World Bank, and I pulled these figures off because I had a feeling you were going to ask me that.
Right.
The World Bank right now has 184 members of countries, usually Western countries, who finance their outreach and development efforts on a global basis. In 2003, the World Bank provided $18.5 billion of aid, financial aid, and of technical expertise to 100 developing countries. So they have a very profound influence both in terms of the quantity of support as well as the breadth and the number of regions that they're carrying out their activities in.
And what's the agenda? Because what you and I are worried about on this program is not whether they're building bridges, that's good, not whether they're building schools, that's good, but what kind of values are they mandating be supported with their money?
Well, ideally, they are to be pursuing the 8 goals established by the United Nations for development, and that would include poverty relief, the eradication of disease, elementary education, very forthright, positive values. But behind those values are a certain, I call it a libertarian philosophy, especially from a moral perspective. You know, when it comes to poverty relief, they believe there's too many people on the planet, and so you have population control efforts.
But does the World Bank fund abortion?
The World Bank funds civil society organizations that have a pro-abortion agenda.
But do abortions actually result from the spending of that money?
I don't know that the World Bank is actually handing the money to abortion providers, but I do know for a fact that some civil society organizations such as Planned Parenthood International and others have an abortion rights agenda that they export from the Western democracies into these developing and third world countries.
Right.
So it's something that if you were to, as an innocent, look at the United Nations and the World Bank and these civil society organizations, you'd say, much as people would say about the Catholic Church, what a wonderful organization, they're serving so much good. But it's really a question of the culture of death versus the culture of life. Those are the stark realities of it. And those discussions and debates take place in the halls of the United Nations.
And of course, Catholic taxpayer dollars are finding their way from the United States to the United Nations, to the World Bank, and into these projects that are, directly contradicting and in competition with Catholic values.
Exactly. And let me give you for instance of one of the most prevalent civil society organizations now is financed by the billionaire financier, Hungarian-born George Soros. And domestically, George Soros has been identified as one of the leading persons behind trying to get George Bush out of office, because his policies of tackling global terrorism sort of interrupt the whole development, secularization agenda of some of these civil society organizations. He has, to date, already put in $15 million into a voter turnout campaign in the United States. Now, when you take someone with that kind of money, and that's the largest political contribution ever in American history from one individual. Right. When you take that and you take that same $15 million and invest it in a developing democracy to try to be a change agent for a libertarian agenda.
It's huge.
Oh, it's, they basically, he can own the government.
Right.
And as a matter of fact.
And own everybody in it.
And, well, and for better or for worse, the recent fall of the former Soviet Republic of Georgia was attributed in large part to George Soros's financing of those activists that were pushing for changes perhaps faster than the system could
And
absorb.
what is the agenda of George Soros?
George Soros, and I have some information on George Soros if I could share with you also. George Soros spent $154,200,000 in 2002, $154 million in areas such as Central and Eastern Europe, the former Soviet republics, Asia, Africa, and Latin America. If I could just share with you. $8,400,000 went to control population growth by funding an anti-pro-life agenda. And there are a lot of developing countries now where the pro-life movement is very strong.
He's funding abortion clinics.
Exactly.
He's funding
and advocacy, legal advocacy against that. $13,500,000 went to control legal systems by training lawyers in criminal justice reforms, including the decriminalization of drug use.
Right.
He is a libertarian, you know, and that's one of their platforms. $7 million to control local government politics and policies. This is all in 1 year. $8,500,000 to control public opinion through the creation of media outlets such as television, radio, and newspaper outlets. $18,700,000 to control higher education. He has a pro-activist, pro-agitation education curriculum that he tries to, integrate into the higher education facilities. And, it goes on and on. $22 million to fund postgraduate education for social activists, all in 1 year. $8,600,000 to control elementary education through what he calls his step-by-step program.
I can only imagine that how much the Catholic Church is spending, and I don't know if we've got those kind of resources.
Well, it's also, it's not just a question of whether the Catholic Church has the resources, but it's also a question of a level playing field, and we've had this discussion in the United States. George Soros and his foundations and other civil society organizations just aren't interested in outspending the Catholic Church. They're also interested in making sure that the Catholic Church does not have a persuasive influence over those people that the civil society organizations are trying to energize into adopting some of these secularization agenda items. So it's just not a question of dollars, it's a question of philosophy, and it's a battle in the public square.
When we come back, we want to talk more with Jim Kelly about the ongoing battle for the development of nations, the character of nations, the character of the young people, the journalists, the teachers, the doctors, the lawyers within these countries, and whether or not there's a way of trying to compete with this kind of money, this kind of influence, which is even flowing from your tax dollars. We'll be right back. I'm talking with Jim Kelly, the Executive Director of the Solidarity Center for Law and Justice in Atlanta, about the ongoing battle over globalization and the fact that the influence of the church has been edged out. Its place has been taken by a combination of the United Nations, of its World Bank, of civil society organizations that are allied with an agenda that is secularizing the cultures and, I suppose, the minds of people all over the world, that religious faith and the traditional values of that faith just simply don't have a place.
Deal, that's right. And it's one thing to talk about the influence that they have monetarily. It's another thing when they start trying to serve as the moral agency for human character. And that's where the church needs to make its stand in drawing the line between, sure, you have a lot of money and you're spending it on development, we applaud you, although some of the libertarian principles aren't consistent with Catholic social and moral teaching, but it's when they start coming in and say, now we're going to take from you your formative role, Catholic Church, we're going to start teaching what I call a political humanism. And I call it political humanism to point out the fact that it's a very relativist form of moral formation that's being taught in schools and universities. And when I say relativist, what they do is they pick those human values, those human rights that are important to their economic and social, cultural philosophy and the advancement of that philosophy, and they make those the sole human rights that they talk about. And they leave behind some of the more normative, moral human rights. And
the family is the first victim.
And the family is the first victim. Children are the first victim, because what it does is it dehumanizes individuals in a very utilitarian way. When you start having education policy teams who come in and say, okay, we need to have some character formation here, let's teach them to be tolerant of other people regardless of what they're doing, as long as they're not physically harming anybody, then there really is no idea of what does it mean to self-sacrifice for a higher good. The very foundation of American democracy, the idea that there was a common good and that you might have to sacrifice your life to advance that common good, is absent. It's a kind of a Brave New World philosophy.
And the understanding of freedom, of course, is unfettered freedom.
License.
License.
Exactly. But the political humanism, it's something that's being produced and promoted by such international organizations like UNESCO, which is the education arm of the United Nations. And it's funny, they all come up with different nomenclature for what their political humanist moral formation agenda is. UNESCO's, they're trying to build a culture of peace. The Amnesty International, theirs is human rights education. Even the U.S. Department of Education has its units called character education. They call it character education.
And remind our viewers, what do they all have in common? Is an avoidance of what?
Religion and the idea of God.
And any moral absolutes.
Having anything to do with theology, with God, with prayer, with contemplation, with sacrifice. It's all what basic, human rights do we need to protect in order to make sure everybody gets to do what they want to do.
We're going to protect abortion. We're going to protect homosexual
relationships and conduct. That's correct.
We're going to
environmental extremism.
Right.
Just anti-capitalist sentiment to the extreme. It's just something. It wouldn't be bad if it was competing on a level playing field. But what they do is, political humanists, and this is both domestically and abroad, they take control of the state education system, and they come in and they pretty much mandate that this is the way that we're going to form young children is through this political humanist education. And if you, private citizen in a developing democracy, want to use your hard-earned dollars to educate your child in a traditional religion, you're going to have to do it on your own, or you're going to have to find a school that's willing to conform to our standards of
and all under the name of democracy.
Yes. So what can Catholics do to sort of take back that platform for formation? And I hearken back to the political and moral philosophy of Jacques Maritain, who you and I share, an affection for.
Maritain's a great 20th century Thomist,
French Catholic philosopher. Yeah. And international man.
And a man who helped write the charter for
human rights. That's right. UNESCO Charter, the
right.
Declaration on Human Rights. He was an ambassador to UNESCO. And throughout 24 of his writings, what I've done is I've gone back and I've tried to find some of his thoughts about how can the active Christian in a society, in a democratic society, how can they conduct themselves in a way that furthers the faith and democracy without dictating the terms of how people should live their lives.
And you call it heroic democracy.
I call it heroic
democracy.
democracy.
Great title. By the way, I should say that I have written the introduction to this book of readings.
That's correct.
Which will be published soon. And it's, I think, a tremendous antidote to what's going on in this country and around the world. People that don't remember the great vision, Christian humanist vision of people, not just Jacques Maritain, but others who do well to get this book and to remind themselves of what we've lost.
Absolutely. Thank you. And I have enjoyed studying this because it gives me great hope. Because the things that he talks about, and there are 13 foundational principles that I've been able to cull from his writings, things such as educate children for freedom.
Right.
That sounds like, of course, that's what we do is educate children for freedom, but the alternative of that is a very technology-oriented education, educate them for a vocation so that they can fill this assembly line job so that multinational corporation will have plenty of workers so that we can attract them with World Bank financing, construct the industrial park. I mean, it's so everybody has their place in this society. But Maritain said, no, we've got to educate people for their whole integral nature, both their supernatural side and their natural side. He believed very much that there had to be contemplation in a democracy. He always called back to the examples of saints.
Because contemplation reminds you who you are.
Exactly.
It reminds you that you are made for not just for this life, for the temporal, but for the supernatural.
Exactly, and then the examples of the saints who've sacrificed themselves for the betterment of society. So Jacques Maritain, he talked about freedom of religion, the necessary element of freedom of religion, because that's the way that faith-based initiatives, which is a big, buzzword these years. Thank goodness for President Bush and his promotion of it. Faith-based initiatives are the way to get back the Christian leaven into society that is necessary to, have it positively
Maritain
evolve.
always talked about the gospel leaven.
Yes, he did.
Of course, a lot of people who've never made bread don't know what leaven is.
All it takes is a little bit of leaven, and that's the great import of fighting for our Catholic schools around the world. Because obviously, when children hear the truth, they'll live the truth. Hopefully, if they understand the faith, and the civil society community understands that. The global civil society community understands that the Catholic Church's message resonates with young people.
And they don't want them to hear it.
No, they don't. And so, you know, they'll take control of that monopolistic
Because
state
it's a real
funding.
heroism.
It is a heroism.
It's not a false heroism.
No, it isn't. And that's another thing. Jacques Maritain was very solid about the need for international cooperation, but he said the minute that internationalists start asking you to leave your own traditions behind when you're formulating what your version of the common good is, then that's the time when you have to sort of take this stand and say, no, you know, there's going to be points upon which we can't agree, and you can't, you know, ask me to abandon my particular religious philosophies just so that I can say, yes, we've achieved a common good.
So he foresaw where we are.
Oh, absolutely. He was a prophet of the people, and that's the reason I think it's so important to go back and examine his works. You know, I'm just glad that through this show and other opportunities, what we have is a need to show people what's happening from an international perspective. We need to start training our leaders. We need to start training lawyers, teachers, you know, professionals, just those people who are the leaven in terms of our judicial system to be active in pursuing heroic democracy.
What do you think is at the heart of this fear of Christian humanism, this fear of the vision of heroic democracy? Why, you know, is there any single issue that is driving the George Soroses of the world?
Well, George Soros is a special example. He makes a lot of money internationally. He hasn't retired from his investment banking. I mean, you know, listen, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, there was a lot of buying low you could do. I mean, there, you know, I was thinking about that this morning. I was thinking, you know, if you were somebody who was making an investment, you have to have subsidiarity, which means that you have